My name is Bella Drake, and I'm 38 years old. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a financial analyst for a regional firm, a job that demands every ounce of my focus and precision. I'm the type of person who thrives on details, who finds comfort in spreadsheets and numbers that balance perfectly at the end of the day. But my life isn't just about quarterly reports and market forecasts. Behind the polished exterior, there's a complex family dynamic that I've been silently managing for years, a balancing act that often feels heavier than any workload I carry at the office. When people hear my story, they usually see the successful woman, the dependable professional who always has her act together. But what they don't see is the quiet role I've played in my family, the one who pays the bills no one talks about. For years, I've been covering my sister Emma's tuition, making sure she has everything she needs to live comfortably and study without worries. I've also been footing the bills for my parents' home, patching together mortgage payments and utilities so that they never have to struggle. It's not because anyone asked me to. It's because I feel responsible. I've always seen it as my duty to keep the family afloat, even when it meant sacrificing my own savings or delaying dreams of my own. It's strange, really, how invisible this role has made me. In family photos, I'm the one standing quietly on the side, the one whose contributions go unmentioned. I'm the silent provider, always there but rarely acknowledged. I remember countless family dinners where laughter echoed around the table, yet I felt like a ghost, a shadow in the room everyone chose to ignore. My efforts became background noise, expected, and taken for granted. Just last week, after a routine family dinner, that quiet existence shattered. We had gathered at my parents' house, the usual mix of small talk and polite smiles filling the air. Emma was there, radiant and confident as always, her charm lighting up the room. I sat beside her, trying to hold on to the fragile calm that often slips away too quickly in these gatherings. But then, the atmosphere changed in a breathless instant. Emma's voice cut through the chatter with a sharp accusation. "You stole my necklace, Bella. The $9,000 one?" The words hung heavy between us, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I blinked, stunned, unable to believe that my own sister would point a finger like that. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain. But before I could say a word, my father's expression hardened. Richard Drake, a man known for his unwavering authority, didn't hesitate. Without asking for my side, without pause or doubt, he ordered me out of the house. "Get out," he said coldly, his voice leaving no room for argument. I was speechless. My husband Michael was by my side, equally shocked, but I felt the sting of betrayal more deeply than I could ever express. As I gathered my things in silence, glancing back at the faces around the table, faces I had hoped would stand for truth, I realized I was suddenly alone. Thrown out not just from a home, but from a family that had no idea how much I had done for them. No one knew I was the one covering Emma's tuition, the one keeping the lights on in that house. No one saw the years of sacrifices hidden behind my quiet demeanor. That night, as I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cold darkness, I felt a finality that wasn't really final at all. It was a fracture in everything I thought I knew, a crack that promised this story was far from over. The betrayal wasn't just about a necklace. It was about trust shattered, loyalty questioned, and a family that had mistaken silence for weakness. And so I began to ask myself, how did I get here? How did the woman who held this family together become the scapegoat, accused and cast aside without a single word of defense? The answers wouldn't come easily, but I knew one thing for certain. If I was going to survive this, I had to understand the roots of this fracture and find a way to reclaim my dignity, whatever it took. It's tempting to blame the moment, the accusation, the sudden eviction, for the fracture in our family. But the truth is, this rupture didn't happen overnight. It's been forming beneath the surface for decades, stretching back to when Emma and I were children. Growing up in the Drake household was like walking a tightrope with no safety net. Every step I took was measured against an invisible standard set by my parents. Emma's charm and beauty always took precedence, while I was cast as the other daughter, the responsible one who never quite fit the mold of their affection. From an early age, the difference in how Emma and I were treated was stark. I remember vividly the day when Emma broke our grandmother's antique vase during a family gathering. The vase was an heirloom, fragile and priceless in sentimental value. When the shards hit the floor, Emma looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes. And somehow, I ended up taking the blame. "Bella must have done it," she whispered to Mom, and my parents never questioned it. The punishment was silent but clear. I was the scapegoat, the one to bear the weight of mistakes, while Emma was shielded by her golden aura. It wasn't just about blame. It extended into the daily rhythms of family life. Vacations, for example, those rare moments meant for bonding, were skewed in Emma's favor. I recall the summer when my father planned a trip to the coast. Emma was excited, talking about the beach and the sunny days ahead. But when it came time to pack, I was told to stay behind. The excuse was practical. "You have work commitments." But in truth, it was a subtle message that I was less deserving of respite or joy. Meanwhile, Emma basked in the glow of parental attention, her laughter ringing across the sand, a sound I could only hear from a distance. I internalized these slights as family quirks, convincing myself that love isn't always fair, but is constant beneath the surface. I believed that if I just worked harder, if I continued to support them silently and without complaint, eventually I'd earn my place, not just as the responsible daughter, but as a daughter worth celebrating. So I took on burdens quietly, covering Emma's tuition, paying for household expenses, managing bills that no one else seemed to notice. I became the invisible backbone, the one who held up the family's facade while they remained unaware of the real cost. Looking back now, I see how this dynamic shaped everything: my sense of self, my expectations, even my relationships. Emma's favoritism wasn't just parental indulgence. It was a force that dictated how love and worth were distributed in our family. I was the reliable shadow, always present, yet perpetually overlooked. Emotional neglect in this form is subtle, but deeply wounding. It whispers to you that you matter less, that your sacrifices should be invisible, that your pain isn't valid. And so, the pattern continued through years of silent endurance. I excused the exclusion from family milestones, the sidelong glances, the dismissive comments that no one else seemed to hear. I rationalized Emma's charm and the parents' indulgence as temporary phases, hoping for a day when recognition might bloom. But those moments never came. Instead, the division deepened. The golden child shielded by privilege and lies, the responsible daughter burdened with invisible chains. Understanding this history is painful, but necessary. It reveals that the necklace accusation wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was the culmination of years of imbalance and unspoken resentments. The family dysfunction was never about me stealing a piece of jewelry. It was about a deeper fracture, one rooted in favoritism, neglect, and a family system built on uneven foundations. And now, as I stand on the edge of this betrayal, I realize that the past isn't just a shadow to endure. It's a force I must confront if I'm ever going to reclaim my life. The sacrifices I made weren't abstract concepts or vague feelings. They were concrete, dollar-for-dollar commitments that I shouldered quietly, day after day. Take Emma's tuition, for example. For 3 full years, I covered every cent of it. Not just the tuition bills, but books, supplies, even the occasional extra class or workshop she wanted to take. I remember the exact moment I agreed to take on that responsibility. It was after a particularly tense phone call with our parents, who hinted, more like implied, that Emma's education was their priority, and that I should do what I could to help. It wasn't phrased as a direct request, but it was clear enough. Without hesitation, I transferred the funds, month after month, watching the bills pile up quietly in my bank statements, while Emma lived her life uninterrupted by financial worries. Covering Emma's tuition wasn't just about money. It was about ensuring she had freedom, the chance to focus on her studies and social life without the stress of expenses. I told myself it was the least I could do for my sister, the one who, despite all the cracks between us, was still family. Meanwhile, I delayed my own dreams, putting off professional courses I wanted to take or saving for a trip Michael and I had talked about for years. My savings account, once meant for our future, slowly dwindled as tuition payments drained it. I never complained. I never asked for recognition. It was just another unseen act of love, or so I believed. Then there were the mortgage payments. Things took a harder turn when Mom's health started to decline. The doctor's visits, the medications, the constant stress. It was clear she couldn't manage the house finances the way she used to. Dad was often away on business trips or absorbed in his own world, leaving the responsibility to me by default. I stepped up without hesitation. Every month I covered the mortgage payments, utilities, property taxes, everything that kept the family home afloat. I even took over scheduling the repairs when things inevitably broke down. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the faulty heater during one brutal winter, the creaking front door that no one else seemed to notice but that gnawed at me every time I visited. While I was handling these financial burdens, the emotional toll was just as heavy. I was juggling late nights at work, weekends spent sorting bills and reconciling accounts, and the constant pressure of making sure no one else felt the pinch. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating stacks of invoices and bank statements. Michael's quiet presence beside me as we both knew I was exhausted but determined. I wanted to protect the family, to keep the peace, to make sure no one fell through the cracks, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace of mind. Sacrificing my own savings for the family's stability became second nature. There were times when I chose to pay a bill instead of investing in our retirement fund, or when I cut back on everyday expenses to pull together extra money for a surprise gift or a needed repair at the house. I remember the ache of denying myself simple pleasures, a night out with friends, a new dress for work, even a small vacation, for the sake of a family I loved but who never saw these sacrifices. The emotional weight of being the invisible provider grew heavier with each passing month, but I clung to the belief that my actions mattered, that eventually, my love and dedication would be recognized. Michael, my husband, was my quiet anchor through all this. He never complained when funds were tight or when I came home drained from a long day at the office and an even longer evening balancing family obligations. He understood my sense of duty, though sometimes I could see the strain in his eyes, a flicker of frustration or sadness when he realized how much I was giving away without receiving much in return. He gently reminded me to take care of myself, to set boundaries, but I was convinced that this was what family meant: sacrifice, patience, and endurance. Despite the exhaustion and the growing sense of invisibility, I held on to hope. I told myself that the bills I paid, the sacrifices I made, were investments, not just in money but in relationships. I believed that someday, the family would see the real cost of my generosity, that they'd appreciate the foundation I quietly built beneath their comfortable lives. I wanted to believe that love wasn't just about words or appearances, but about the actions taken when no one's watching. And so I endured, kept giving, and kept believing that my sacrifices would eventually lead to peace, gratitude, and maybe even happiness within our fractured family. But deep down, a shadow lingered, a quiet voice that wondered if my sacrifices were truly valued, or if they were just expected, absorbed into the background like the hum of electricity. That nagging doubt was always there, whispering in moments of solitude, growing louder with every unacknowledged payment, every overlooked effort, and I pushed it away, burying it beneath the weight of duty and hope, not yet ready to face the truth that would soon come crashing down. That recent family gathering felt like a turning point, though at the time, I tried to convince myself it was just another rough patch in the ongoing saga that was my life with the Drakes. We'd gathered at a cousin's birthday party held at a swanky downtown loft, the kind of place where the air buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, and the scent of expensive perfumes mingled with the aroma of gourmet hors d'oeuvres. I'd gone hoping, maybe naively, for a night of lightheartedness, something to break the tension that always seemed to hover over family events. Instead, it turned into a public display of everything I'd been trying to avoid. Emma arrived dressed to the nines, as always, wearing that effortless designer dress that seemed to hug her every curve. Her hair sparkled under the soft lighting, and she carried herself with a confidence that was almost magnetic. People naturally gravitated toward her, hanging on every word she said with smiles and nods. I, on the other hand, stood slightly apart, clutching my wine glass more out of habit than enjoyment, watching the scene unfold with a sinking feeling I recognized all too well. The moment came when Emma, in that unmistakably condescending tone, turned to me and said loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "You know, Bella's job is just crunching numbers all day. It's not exactly glamorous like mine." Her words carried a sharpness that cut through the ambient noise, and I could feel the sudden shift in the air, the way heads turned, some with amusement, others with a hint of sympathy. Emma's social circle laughed lightly, as if this was some inside joke, and I realized immediately that this wasn't about humor. It was a strategic jab, a way to undermine me in front of people who barely knew the complex realities behind my work. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to explain that my job as a financial analyst wasn't just numbers, that it was the backbone of stability for many families and businesses, including ours. But the words caught in my throat. It wasn't just the insult itself, it was the way my father, Richard, responded that stung the most. Instead of stepping in, supporting me, or even asking for my perspective, he turned toward Emma with a proud smile and said, "That's our Emma, always the life of the party. Bella's work is important, sure, but she's not exactly the shining star of the family, is she?" I stood frozen for a moment, the heat rising in my chest. My mother, Karen, sat quietly beside him, her expression a mix of discomfort and resignation, eyes flickering away as if trying to pretend none of this was happening. I caught Michael's gaze from across the room, his eyes filled with a mix of anger, pain, and helplessness. But no one spoke up for me. No one challenged the narrative that Emma was the gem of the family, and I was reduced to an afterthought. What made it worse was the way Emma's smile widened, triumphant and unapologetic. She basked in the attention, clearly knowing that her words had landed exactly as she intended. I could feel the weight of years of silencing and invisibility pressing down on me. The countless times I'd been dismissed, overlooked, or outright ignored, now playing out in front of an audience that barely blinked. After that moment, the gathering continued, but the warmth had drained from the room for me. Every laugh from Emma felt like a reminder of my invisibility. I tried to remind myself that this was just sibling rivalry blown out of proportion, that these things happened, and that perhaps tomorrow the family would regroup and find a way back to harmony. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Doubt about whether my sacrifices, my work, my very presence truly mattered to them. That night, as I lay awake in bed beside Michael, the echoes of Emma's words and my father's dismissive gaze haunted me. I realized that this wasn't just a family spat. It was a symptom of a much deeper issue, a growing chasm that my quiet endurance had only papered over. The golden child basked in privilege and praise, while I remained in the shadows, invisible and unappreciated despite everything I'd given. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the tuition payments, the mortgage, the countless bills I'd covered without so much as a thank you, and I wondered if any of it had ever really mattered to them. Emma's entitlement had grown unchecked, fueled by my family's willingness to overlook my contributions and inflate her status. My heart ached not only for the lack of recognition, but for the way my father, the man who was supposed to protect and support me, had sided so swiftly and completely against me. That evening's humiliation wasn't just about words. It was a public dismissal of my identity, my worth, and the quiet labor that had kept the family afloat. And while I tried to push the sting aside, I knew that these moments were carving deeper wounds beneath the surface, wounds that would soon demand reckoning. The fracture that had been quietly growing within our family was no longer something I could ignore or endure silently. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, sharp and sudden. We were gathered at my parents' house for what was supposed to be a quiet Sunday afternoon. Just a few hours to catch up, share a meal, maybe laugh at old stories. The kind of normal family time that, for me, felt more like a fragile truce than genuine peace. Emma's voice cut through the air with an icy edge that froze everything else around us. "You stole my necklace, Bella. The $9,000 one. Where is it?" The room stilled instantly. The clinking of forks against plates, the hum of subdued chatter, even the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. All those familiar background noises faded into a suffocating silence. I stared at Emma, disbelief rooting me to my seat. My mind scrambled, searching for words, for the logic that could explain this absurd accusation. I had never touched that necklace. The thought that my own sister would accuse me of theft was beyond comprehension. Before I could speak, before I could defend myself, my father's face darkened. Richard Drake, the man whose word was law in our family, looked at me with cold, unyielding eyes. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. His voice was low and commanding as he cut through the stunned quiet. "Bella, get out. Now." His words were a final decree, an unchallengeable sentence. No questions, no chance to explain. It was as if I'd become an enemy overnight, a traitor to the family I'd spent years supporting. Michael, standing beside me, reached out to steady me, his expression a mix of shock and helplessness. Yet even his presence couldn't stem the swift tide of rejection. I gathered my belongings automatically, my hands trembling but my mind oddly numb. I glanced over my shoulder, searching the faces around the room. My mother's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she said nothing. Emma watched me with a triumphant smirk, her accusation now a weapon wielded with cruel precision. The neighbors and family friends who had quietly gathered for the visit looked on, their eyes wide with surprise, some whispering to each other, others avoiding my gaze altogether. I felt exposed, humiliated, like a spectacle stripped bare of any dignity. As I stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the weight of being cast out pressed down on me more heavily than the autumn chill. The door closed behind me with a definitive click, sealing off not just the house, but the sense of belonging I had clung to despite the cracks beneath the surface. The irony was suffocating. I had been the one quietly paying the bills, the tuition, the endless stream of expenses that kept our family's life from unraveling. Yet no one knew. No one saw the sacrifices I had made. The nights spent crunching numbers to cover the mortgage or the bank transfers to keep Emma's schooling uninterrupted. That evening, as Michael and I sat in the dim light of our living room, I replayed the moment over and over. How had it come to this? How had the sister I once shared secrets with become the person who pointed a finger and destroyed my place in this family? I remembered the countless times I had absorbed blame silently, hoping it was just a phase, that love beneath the surface would one day shine through. But now, it felt like that hope was nothing more than a fragile illusion. What stung the most was not just the accusation itself, but the way my father had turned his back on me without a second thought. Richard, who had once been my protector, had become the judge and executioner, blind to the truth I desperately needed him to hear. And my mother? Caught somewhere between denial and fear, she had chosen silence over support. As the night deepened, the house felt emptier than ever. The familiar sounds of family life, laughing children, the clatter of dishes, the warmth of shared meals, were gone, replaced by a cold void. I realized then how invisible I had become, how my generosity had been mistaken for weakness, my loyalty for something to be manipulated. The $9,000 necklace was never just about a piece of jewelry. It was the symbol of a breach so deep that it shattered the fragile trust I had tried to build over years. It marked the point where unspoken resentment surfaced in the sharpest possible way, by accusing me, the silent provider, of betrayal. In that moment, I understood that the family I had supported so quietly didn't see me at all. They saw only what they wanted, a scapegoat, an easy target to blame. And yet, even as the cold night wrapped around us, I felt something else stirring, a quiet but fierce determination. They didn't know the whole story. They didn't know how much I had done, how much I had sacrificed. And now that the mask had slipped, the path forward was no longer about enduring silence or invisibility. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and facing the truth that lay beneath the fractured surface of our family. The fracture wasn't just about a necklace. It was about years of lies, denial, and misplaced loyalty. And though that evening ended with me walking away from the house, it also marked the beginning of a reckoning I could no longer avoid. The night after I was thrown out, I sat alone in the dim light of our small apartment, the silence pressing in like a heavy fog. Michael was asleep beside me, but I couldn't find rest. My mind was a whirlwind, spinning endlessly through the events of the day. The sudden accusation, my father's harsh words, Emma's triumphant glare. At first, I just felt crushed, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief and disbelief. How could they turn on me like this? How could the family I had carried, who depended on me in so many invisible ways, discard me in a single moment? For hours, I let myself feel the hurt, raw and aching. It was like a physical weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I remembered every unpaid bill I had quietly covered, every tuition check I had written, and every repair I had arranged for the house. All those sacrifices, now seeming invisible, meaningless to the people I loved most. The sting wasn't just in their rejection. It was in realizing that my loyalty had been met with mistrust, my generosity twisted into a weapon against me. But grief has a strange way of evolving. As the night deepened, slowly, the haze began to clear. The sadness was still there, but beneath it, a new feeling started to take shape. Cold clarity. I pulled out the bank statements I kept meticulously, receipts marking years of financial support that no one had acknowledged. I sifted through months, sometimes years, of payments, tuition bills for Emma's college, mortgage installments for my parents' house, utility bills, unexpected repair costs. Every dollar traced back to me. The numbers didn't lie, but the family's narrative did. I thought about the emotional toll, too. The way I had been blamed for things I never did, silenced when I tried to explain, and dismissed as just the responsible one, the background figure in their stories. I recalled the times Emma had subtly manipulated conversations to paint me as the villain, the moments my parents had turned blind eyes to her lies, and the way my attempts to bridge the widening gap were met with cold indifference or outright hostility. Each memory was a piece of a puzzle that, when put together, revealed a harsh truth. They had never truly seen me. Not really. The necklace accusation wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of falsehoods and neglect. The family's trust wasn't misplaced. It was never there to begin with. Their love had been conditional, a fragile facade resting on favoritism and selective blindness. While I was busy keeping the lights on and the bills paid, they were rewriting the story, casting me as the villain without a second thought. That realization hit hard, but it also sparked something fierce inside me. I understood now that the family wasn't going to change, that no amount of silent sacrifice would earn me the respect or safety I deserved. The hope I had clung to was just a mirage, blurring the reality of my place in their hearts. They weren't grateful. They were entitled. With that cold clarity came a resolve. I couldn't keep bending, breaking, and giving without recognition. I owed them nothing. Not loyalty built on lies, not gratitude demanded through silence. It was time to stop being the invisible provider, the scapegoat, the one who absorbed their mistakes and masked their dysfunction. I knew that reclaiming my dignity meant more than just distancing myself emotionally. It meant taking control of the finances that I had managed alone for so long. The bills I paid were my leverage, my power. If I stopped shouldering that burden, the family would have to confront their own irresponsibility. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine boundaries, firm ones, where respect was non-negotiable, where my contributions weren't gifts to be exploited but choices I made on my own terms. I wasn't sure yet how or when I'd act on this new resolve, but I could feel it growing inside me, the quiet determination to no longer be invisible, to no longer accept betrayal as the price of love. The fracture in our family was deep, but I was no longer willing to be the one who fixed it alone. In the cold clarity of that lonely night, surrounded by the evidence of my sacrifices and the echoes of their betrayal, I made a silent vow. This story wasn't over, and I would write the next chapter on my own terms. That night, after the door slammed shut behind me, I didn't retreat into despair as much as I shifted into a mode I knew well: analysis. My years as a financial analyst hadn't just trained me to manage numbers in spreadsheets. They had sharpened my ability to dissect situations, identify patterns, and strategize solutions under pressure. Now, faced with family betrayal and rejection, I needed to apply the same rigor to my personal life. The emotional fog was lifting, and in its place, a cold clarity emerged. If I was going to protect myself, and maybe even reclaim some measure of control, I had to be methodical. I started by gathering every shred of documentation I could find: bank statements, tuition receipts, mortgage records, utility bills, all meticulously filed, yet until now mostly ignored by my family. Pulling them out that night, I spread the papers across the dining table, illuminated only by the soft glow of a single lamp. The silence of the apartment was deafening, but I welcomed it. Here, with numbers in front of me, there was no room for lies or emotional manipulation. As I flipped through pages, I traced the trail of my financial support over the years. Each payment was a testament to the invisible labor I had performed for the Drake family. There were monthly transfers totaling thousands of dollars. Emma's tuition, semester after semester, faithfully covered so she could focus on her studies without a care. I remembered the nights I'd stayed late at work, sacrificing my own rest just to make sure funds were transferred on time. Then there were the mortgage payments, covering the family home's roof and foundation, so my parents didn't have to face the stress of arrears or foreclosure notices. Utilities, repairs, groceries, the endless stream of expenses that I quietly managed, trying to keep the household afloat. But the numbers were only half the story. I started compiling notes I'd kept, conversations, text messages, emails, little details that painted a broader picture of the emotional labor I'd invested. The times I had smoothed over conflicts, absorbed blame, or ignored my own feelings so the family could appear normal. I had documented Emma's subtle lies, her manipulations disguised as innocent remarks, and the way my parents consistently sided with her, dismissing my perspective. This wasn't just about money. It was about a pattern of exploitation and disregard that had eroded my sense of belonging. Sitting there with records spread before me, I realized I was sitting on leverage the family didn't even know existed. The bills I'd paid, the tuition covered, they depended on me, not just emotionally, but financially. I was the invisible engine that kept the Drake household running. And now, for the first time, I could see a path to recalibrate the power dynamics. Michael sat beside me in quiet support, his presence steady and reassuring. He didn't say much, but I knew he shared my growing resolve. We talked long into the night, weighing options. I needed to protect my assets legally, so I reached out to a trusted attorney the next day. The conversations with her were sobering, but empowering. We discussed the possibilities of severing financial ties, updating wills to reflect my true intentions, and securing my personal accounts from unauthorized access. It was a process that required careful planning and precision, but I was ready to embark on it. Throughout all this, I maintained a calm exterior around my family, careful not to reveal the storm brewing beneath. I knew this wasn't a battle to be fought with emotion. It had to be strategic. The more I learned about their dependence on my funds, the more I saw how my withdrawal could force them to face their complacency and dishonesty. This phase of planning was deeply personal and exhausting. It demanded that I confront painful truths, dismantle long-held illusions about my family's gratitude, and prepare to stand firm in the face of inevitable backlash. But it also brought a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't just the silent provider or scapegoat. I was the architect of my own boundaries, ready to rewrite the rules of engagement. As I closed the files late that night, the weight of years of invisible sacrifice still pressed on my shoulders. Yet beneath that heaviness, there was a flicker of hope, a promise that I would no longer be the family's secret bank or emotional punching bag. The next steps would not be easy, but I was resolved. The fractures in our family were deep, but I was done being their foundation without recognition. It was time to reclaim my dignity, one calculated move at a time. In the days following that cold, unexpected exile from my parents' home, I began a subtle but deliberate withdrawal from the family web. I had long been the silent thread holding together. It wasn't a dramatic, headline-making break at first. No shouting matches or public confrontations. Instead, it was a quiet unraveling, a slow loosening of the financial and emotional ties that had bound me to a family that had so casually cast me aside. The first sign of this shift was in the way I answered their calls. Before, I'd pick up almost immediately, even if I was at work or in the middle of something. I felt responsible, as if my availability was a lifeline for them. But now, I let the phone ring longer, sometimes letting calls go to voicemail entirely. When I did respond, my answers were shorter, more measured, carefully neutral. I stopped volunteering information or reassurance. I could sense their surprise, the way the usual urgency in their voices faltered as they realized I was no longer the immediate safety net I once was. Financially, I began to tighten the reins. The mortgage payment for the family home, which I had quietly sent every month, was the first to be paused. It felt like a small rebellion, but also a necessary boundary. I emailed the mortgage company to confirm that future payments would be on hold, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout. I knew this would rattle them, but I needed them to confront the real consequences of their complacency. The tuition payments for Emma's college were the next to be cut off. I logged into the university's online portal and canceled the automatic payments I'd set up years ago. The shock hit me harder than I expected, a pang of guilt mixed with relief. I reminded myself firmly that Emma had no right to treat me like a thief when I'd been the one funding her education without complaint. Still, the silence left by that canceled transaction felt weightier than any spoken word. I took further steps to protect my financial autonomy. Passwords on all my banking apps were changed, ensuring that no unauthorized access could occur. I updated my will and beneficiary designations, removing Emma and my father, Richard, from any claims or inheritances. It was a cold administrative act, but one that carried immense emotional weight. These actions were my way of reclaiming control, a clear message that I was no longer the invisible provider. Throughout all this, I maintained a composed exterior during family interactions. When they reached out, bewildered or desperate, I kept my tone calm, my responses deliberate and non-committal. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel or react emotionally. Instead, I became a quiet force of consequence, letting my absence and the withdrawal of support speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I saw the subtle ways they tried to probe, to test if I was serious. My mother's hesitant questions about the mortgage payments, my father's awkward attempts to discuss bills like adults, and Emma's thinly veiled pleas disguised as casual chat all missed their mark. I had built walls, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Each request I declined, each delayed reply, chipped away at their expectations and entitlement. It was a lonely process. I missed the illusion of family harmony, even if it was fragile and built on uneven ground. There were moments when my heart ached to pick up the phone and assure them that I was still there. But the memory of betrayal, the sting of accusation, tempered that impulse. I reminded myself that this was not abandonment. It was protection. As the weeks passed, the tension beneath the surface grew palpable. Family gatherings grew quieter. Invitations became scarce, and messages dwindled. I knew they were scrambling behind the scenes, trying to understand how their financial safety net had suddenly vanished. Yet, I remained resolute. This wasn't about punishment. It was about teaching them that loyalty and respect cannot be one-sided. The withdrawal was my first tactical move, a test to see who in my family truly valued me beyond my bank account. I was ready for the fallout, the anger, the denials, and the manipulations that would surely come. But beneath it all, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. For the first time in years, I wasn't just the family's invisible provider. I was the author of my own boundaries, shaping a new chapter on my own terms. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with unwavering clarity: the silence I maintained and the support I withheld would force the family to face truths they had long ignored. The fracture was no longer one-sided. It was time for them to reckon with the cost of broken trust. That day, I made a decision that would mark a turning point, not just in my family's story, but in my own life. I sat down at my desk early in the morning, the weight of years pressing on my shoulders, and began drafting formal letters that I knew would shock the people I once trusted implicitly. These weren't angry, impulsive notes. They were calculated, precise, and firm. I carefully outlined my intentions to cease all financial support immediately. The tuition payments for Emma's college, The mortgage installments that kept the family home safe, the utilities, the repairs. I was cutting the lifelines I had quietly maintained for so long. I addressed one letter to my father, Richard, and another to Emma, each word measured to leave no room for misunderstanding. I explained that due to the recent betrayal, the false accusation of theft, and the disregard for my contributions, I was no longer willing to carry the financial burden for a family that had turned its back on me. I emphasized that this was not a decision made lightly, but one born from years of silence, sacrifice, and finally, a refusal to be taken for granted any longer. Once the letters were sent, I moved on to another painful but necessary step, updating my will. I had long postponed this, hoping for reconciliation, believing that blood ties meant unconditional support. But now, with a clarity sharpened by betrayal, I removed both Emma and my father from any inheritance or claims. This was a symbolic, yet profound severance, a line drawn in legal ink that spoke volumes about the distance I was creating. I instructed my attorney to make sure the changes were airtight, knowing that in a family like mine, where loyalty was fickle, every safeguard mattered. But I didn't stop there. The next move was more difficult in a different way, exposing the truth. For years, Emma had maintained a facade of independence and generosity, but I had documented evidence showing that she had never contributed financially in any meaningful way. I compiled statements, bank records, and notes that contradicted the graceful image she projected. I reached out to trusted family friends and community members, not to incite drama, but to reveal the reality beneath the polished surface. It was a controlled disclosure, shared with those whose discretion I trusted, aimed at breaking the cycle of lies that had allowed Emma's falsehoods to flourish unchecked. The reactions were immediate and unsettling. Questions began to circulate quietly, whispers at church gatherings, hushed conversations at community events. People started to see cracks in the story they had long accepted. They asked why the golden child suddenly found herself without the financial support she had grown accustomed to. Slowly, the family's carefully maintained narrative began to unravel, and with it, Emma's untouchable image fractured. I also made a clear boundary in my day-to-day life. It was painful but necessary to withdraw my children from visits to my parents' house. Those weekends that once felt like a chance for connection now carried a heavy, toxic atmosphere that I refused to expose my family to. Michael supported me in this decision, understanding that protecting our children's emotional well-being was now a priority over forced family appearances. It was another silent message. The old rules no longer applied. Throughout this process, I maintained a calm, composed exterior. Behind closed doors, I wrestled with waves of sorrow and anger, but publicly, I was resolute. I refused to be the family's invisible provider any longer, the one who absorbed their dysfunction and paid for it without acknowledgement. Instead, I became a figure of consequence, someone who set boundaries and refused to be manipulated. The fallout was swift. Emma called repeatedly, her voice laced with panic and entitlement, begging for explanations and mercy. My father's attempts to reach me were cold and distant, veiled in authority but lacking the warmth of a father's concern. My mother's discomfort was palpable, caught between daughters she no longer knew how to support. But I held firm, knowing that bending now would erase the progress I had fought so hard to make. In the silence that followed my withdrawal, the family was forced to confront a reality they had long ignored. The bills went unpaid, the tuition deadlines approached, and the home repairs stalled. The financial safety net I had provided was gone, and along with it, the illusion of stability. Looking back on those days, I realized that this was more than just revenge or retaliation. It was a reclamation of power and dignity. By cutting the financial ties and exposing the truth, I was no longer the sacrificial lamb, but a woman demanding respect and accountability. The necklace accusation had shattered the illusion of family harmony, but my actions rebuilt a new foundation, one where silence and sacrifice were no longer the currency of loyalty. Yet, even as the dust settled and the family scrambled to piece together what had changed, I knew this was just the beginning. The fractures exposed were not easily mended, and the path ahead remained uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I had rarely known before, control. A hard-earned sense of control that came not from pleasing others, but from standing firm in my truth and refusing to be invisible any longer. The days that followed my quiet withdrawal were a tempest of missed calls, desperate texts, and a suffocating weight of guilt-tripped pleas pouring in from Emma and my father, Richard. It was as if suddenly the financial lifelines I'd been silently tethering to this fractured family had snapped, leaving them adrift and panicked in the wake of my absence. Emma's voice was the first to pierce the silence, not the confident, polished tone I was used to, but something raw and unsteady, trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Bella, please, it's just a misunderstanding. You know I'd never accuse you of anything like that if I thought it was true," she said, her voice cracking. "I need you to help me. The tuition deadline is coming up, and I don't know what to do." But I held my ground, keeping my words measured and my tone calm, even as my heart clenched. "Emma, this isn't about the necklace anymore. It's about respect. You've lied, and my support isn't unconditional. You need to start taking responsibility for yourself." Her silence on the other end was deafening, followed by a shaky, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." But apologies were no longer enough to bridge the chasm that years of betrayal had carved. Then came my father's calls, abrasive, commanding, and laced with that old patriarchal authority that once made me feel small, even when I tried to stand tall. "Bella, you're making a mistake. We're family. We don't just cut each other off like this," he insisted, his voice cold but strained. "You think you can just walk away and leave us to deal with the bills? This isn't how we do things in this family." His words triggered a mix of anger and sorrow in me. "Dad, I've been carrying this family for years, and this isn't walking away. It's setting boundaries. If you want help, then start by acknowledging the truth and stop turning a blind eye to lies." The conversation ended abruptly, his silence telling me everything I needed to know. The man who once seemed untouchable, the authority who threw me out without a word, was now scrambling to maintain control as the foundations beneath him trembled. When their direct attempts failed, Emma and Richard enlisted Mom, Karen, to mediate. I could hear the tension in her hesitant voice during our brief conversations, the way she tiptoed around the truth, desperate to patch what seemed irreparable. "Bella, please, can't we just talk? Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. We love you," she said softly, but her words felt hollow, weighed down by years of passive enabling. I wanted to believe her, to find that flicker of hope in her tone, but I couldn't ignore the pattern, the way she'd always chosen silence over confrontation, how her love had too often been a quiet shield for Emma's manipulations. "Mom, I need more than words. I need accountability. This family can't keep pretending nothing's wrong while blaming me for everything." Each call, each message was a reminder of the stakes. To Emma, my withdrawal was a crisis threatening her carefree world. To Dad, it was an affront to his authority. And to Mom, a heartbreaking fracture she seemed powerless to mend. But for me, it was a necessary reckoning, a turning point where I refused to be the family's invisible safety net any longer. In the background, I could almost hear the frantic scrambling, Emma's whispered phone calls to friends, Richard's curt conversations with their lawyer, Karen's tearful pleas to other family members. The house that once felt like a sanctuary for them was now a pressure cooker of anxiety and confusion, the bills piling up as the auto pays I'd canceled went unpaid. The mortgage company's calls began, the university's reminders pressed closer, and the growing silence on my end was a stark contrast to the chaos they faced. At times, I wrestled with the weight of my choices, the loneliness of standing firm against the entire family. But beneath it all was a resolve tempered by years of pain and invisibility. I refused to be the one who paid for their dysfunction anymore. The cost had become too high, and the price of silence too steep. Though their panic filled the airwaves and invaded my inbox, I remained unmoved. This was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about reclaiming my life. And if they wanted to rebuild, the foundation had to be honest or it wouldn't stand at all. The days following my withdrawal felt like a slow-motion collapse for my family, though I was watching it all from a distance, cloaked in resolve. The bills I'd paid without question, the mortgage, utilities, tuition, Those quiet pillars supporting their lives suddenly began to falter, and the cracks became impossible to ignore. I heard through relatives and occasional voicemails that the first tangible impact hit the house itself. The mortgage company, patient at first, started sending letters marked urgent, with deadlines looming and warnings of foreclosure. Our family home, once a symbol of stability and shared memories, was now teetering on the edge of loss. The thought should have stirred some sympathy in me, but all I felt was a hardened sense of justice. For years, I had kept that roof over their heads with my own funds, while being dismissed and accused. Now they'd have to face the reality that the foundation I had silently maintained was no longer guaranteed. Emma's world, too, began to unravel rapidly. Without the tuition payments I'd faithfully made, she suddenly faced a stark reality. College deadlines don't bend for excuses or family drama. I knew through a mutual friend that she was scrambling, contacting financial aid offices, desperately applying for emergency loans, trying to patch holes she had never anticipated. The image of the carefree, privileged sister, who never lifted a finger to contribute, was dissolving fast. Her academic standing started to suffer because of missed payments and mounting stress. It was a harsh lesson in responsibility, one she seemed unprepared to learn. Richard, my father, found himself in a precarious position as well. His carefully crafted image of authority and control began to crack. Word spread quietly among family friends and community members. Whispers of the financial chaos at the Drake household, the sudden inability to keep up with bills, the growing tension behind closed doors. Richard's reputation, once untouchable, was now tinged with rumors of neglect and favoritism gone wrong. I could almost hear the murmurs. How could the man who wielded so much power falter so spectacularly in his own family? In the face of this unraveling, their attempts at damage control were frenetic, but fruitless. I received indirect messages, half-hearted apologies, veiled threats, pleas masked as concern. Emma's voice, once confident and commanding, was now anxious and shaky when she spoke to mutual friends. Richard tried to rally allies, painting me as the villain, the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in a time of crisis. But these narratives rang hollow to anyone who knew the whole truth. Karen, caught in the crossfire, oscillated between urging reconciliation and tiptoeing around the realities of her daughter's conflict. Her passive enabling had long been a quiet force in the family dynamics, and now that the consequences were unavoidable, she seemed overwhelmed. I sensed her desperation when she reached out to me, but my walls had been built too firmly. Words alone would never undo years of betrayal and neglect. As the financial pressure mounted, new manipulations emerged. Emma played the victim with renewed intensity, crying about how hard life had become, blaming the sudden hardship on me, accusing me of destroying her future. Richard tried to wield his patriarchal authority to guilt me into doing the right thing, but I stood unmoved. I documented every interaction, every attempt to provoke or manipulate, knowing that accountability was the only way forward. Some family members, previously silent or indifferent, began to express regret, quiet admissions that maybe things hadn't been as simple as they appeared. Others doubled down on blame, unwilling to face uncomfortable truths. The community's perception was shifting, old alliances fracturing as the story unfolded beyond the walls of our family home. Through it all, I remained composed. Each unanswered call, each ignored text, was a deliberate boundary. I was no longer the silent enabler or the invisible provider. Instead, I was a woman reclaiming her dignity, standing firm as the consequences rippled outward. And yet, beneath the surface of this upheaval, the future still lay unclear. The financial pressures were only the beginning, the public fracturing just a symptom of deeper wounds. The Drake family was forced to confront a truth they had long avoided, even as I prepared for the challenges that awaited beyond this storm. The aftermath of my decisions settled over the Drake family like a thick fog, heavy, inescapable, and charged with unspoken tension. I watched from a distance, quietly but resolutely, as the fabric of what once felt like a family unraveled in slow motion. The home, once a sanctuary, now bore the strain of unpaid bills and mounting debts. Emma's carefully curated facade of ease cracked under the pressure of missed tuition payments and the reality she had long avoided. And my father, Richard, who had once wielded his authority like a shield, now struggled to hold the pieces together as whispers of neglect and favoritism seeped beyond our walls. I knew, deep down, that my withdrawal had forced them to confront truths they had long ignored. Truths about dependence, entitlement, and the cost of their silence. But even as I held firm, I was building more than just walls. I was constructing new boundaries, lines drawn not out of anger, but out of self-respect and necessity. The phone calls started to slow. Emma's frantic apologies, my father's attempts at reconciliation, and my mother's gentle entreaties to keep the family together. Karen's voice, once hesitant and shadowed by indecision, grew more earnest with every conversation. Yet no matter how softly she spoke, her words couldn't erase years of neglect or the sharp sting of accusations that had cut me deeper than any family disagreement ever had. When I finally spoke, it was with calm but unyielding clarity. "If we are to have any future together, it has to be on new terms," I told her one afternoon, my voice steady but firm. "There must be respect, accountability, equal footing. I can no longer be the silent provider, the scapegoat, or the one who absorbs every fault without acknowledgement. This family has to change, or I will keep my distance." Those words hung heavily between us, a declaration of boundaries that marked a turning point. It was no longer about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about demanding the dignity I had long been denied. I wasn't interested in half measures or empty promises. I needed real change, tangible acts that honored the sacrifices I'd made and the wounds I carried. Michael stood by me throughout, his support unwavering. Together, we chose to focus on the family we were building, one grounded in mutual respect and genuine care, free from the shadows of past betrayals. Protecting our children became a priority, shielding them from the toxicity that had seeped into the Drake family for far too long. We created space for healing, but only on my terms, with boundaries firmly in place. Yet even as I embraced this new chapter, I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The choices I had made rippled outward, forcing my family to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Some relatives began to question the narrative they had been told. Others hardened their defenses, and the community's perception of us shifted in subtle, yet undeniable ways. But through it all, I felt a clarity I hadn't known before, a fierce sense of control and self-worth that no accusation or betrayal could diminish. The necklace had been a symbol of broken trust, but it was also a catalyst for transformation. It stripped away illusions and demanded that I no longer settle for being invisible. Whether the Drakes would choose to grow or remain trapped in old patterns was no longer my burden. I had drawn the line. I had reclaimed my voice. And in that reclaimed space, I found a freedom I had long been denied. The freedom to stand tall, to be seen, and to demand the respect I deserved. The story was far from over, but this chapter was mine to write, on my own terms and with unwavering resolve.